Brian here with the Stone Trust again. We're going to look at using feather and wedges, splitting up some of these granite blocks, and I'm here today with TJ Mora. Okay, so here we are looking at some feather and wedges. Now, these come in sets, and what we have is the two side shims, are usually called feathers. Sometimes they're also called shims. And then we have a center piece, which is usually called a wedge. Sometimes it's also called a plug. And we insert these into a hole that's drilled in the stone so that the feathers are all the way down in the hole and the wedge is just started. And then by repeatedly tapping the wedge in, it expands and splits the stone. And we'll have a line of these in the rock. Now, these come in different sizes and they come in a set of 5. So a set of 5 would be 5 wedges, 10 feathers in one set. And that's enough to do a decent sized stone. And you can get multiple sets for bigger stones. This set that I'm holding right now is called a 3/4 inch feather and wedge. And it's designed so that that'll split, in most cases, a stone up to maybe 30 inches thick or so. And in some cases, much more. These smaller ones are called a 1/2 inch feather and wedge. And these split pretty readily up to 18 inches thick and sometimes as much as 2 feet thick, pretty reasonably. The sizes are based on the hole size that you drill, and we sell typically 1/2 inch, 5/8, and 3/4. Now the caveat there is that the 3/4, these guys, if you actually drill a 3/4 inch hole, the wedge sinks in too low, about like that, before you've started to tap them in. So we usually use an 11/16 or even a 5/8 hole for these bigger wedges as well. The advantage to using smaller ones is that you can drill the holes much, much faster. They also cost a little bit less, but the big advantage is that you can drill faster, it's less dust, less wear and tear on your drill, and it's also less marks. You can see this rock here, there's drill marks from this piece being split. And this was done, it looks like, with the 3/4 inch size. Nice big marks there. And so if you're trying to hide those marks, like these ones at the end, it's much easier to do that with a smaller feather and wedge. The feather and wedges do take a beating. You can see in my pile of them here, some of them are pretty bent, mangled. And when that happens, I just straighten them back out. Eventually they'll wear out, but they can last a really long time. They're very easy to lose. And so you'll see there's little bits of orange paint on mine. I usually try to keep them painted nice and orange so that I can find them in the ground. That's usually the biggest problem with feather and wedges, is we lose them as we use them. Oh. Okay, so here we have the granite block here. It's set up on this piece of wood. And if you see from the end, we're going to be splitting down the length of it, that the weight of the stone itself is naturally going to try to open out and split the way we want. In this case, we're going to split this piece of granite to make through stones or maybe some cheek end material. And so we're splitting it down the length of the stone. And it's helpful to give yourself a mark and a guide. So I'm just using some chalk to give myself a mark of the line we're going to split on. Depending on the project you're doing, this can be very precise, just done by eye. But as you're starting out, it's helpful to have a mark. Now, we have to think about how far apart our feathers and wedges are going to be. And that's based on the type of stone, how thick the stone is, and also a little bit on how precise a break we're looking for. In general, I find that a good rule of thumb is to be about 1.5 to 2 times the length of the wedge with the holes apart. If it's a really thick stone, I might go down to about the length of the wedge. But somewhere in that range tends to be a good starting point, and then as you get used to the stone you're splitting, you can make adjustments. Historically, when they were drilling the holes by hand, sometimes the holes would be as much as 1 foot or 18 inches apart, and depending on the stone they were using. So you can really push these a lot. With the power drills now, we tend to over drill and have them much closer together than on this rock. If we're being precise about it, we've got about a 31-inch rock or so. And for depth, this rock is about 12 inches. We're gonna try to do these about every 4 or 4.5 inches apart or so. And you don't wanna have one right near the edge of the rock, or it'll tend to do weird things right at the edge. So we're just gonna come in a few inches. And I'm used to really just laying these out by eye. But you can, if you like, really measure very precisely. Right now, a tape measure is just sort of giving me a guide. I want to have one near the edge, but not right at the edge. There we are. So each of my cross hatches is where we're going to drill a hole. And we're going to be using the little 1/2-inch feather and wedges because we can drill those holes fast. And we're only splitting a 12-inch thick stone. So we're doing another video where we'll talk about the drills and drill types that we use. But in this case, I've got a 1/2-inch drill bit in this drill. I've wrapped tape around it at the length of the wedge. That's how deep I need to drill. Just that 2.5 inches. And we're gonna drill a hole at each of these points. It's important to remember, granite dust is pretty toxic to the lungs. You don't wanna be breathing granite dust in. So I use a respirator. A paper mask that seals well will work fine too. I just go through a lot of those, so I use one of these. In addition to the respirator for the dust, a couple other safety notes to pay attention to. Earplugs because the drill is loud, safety glasses, and also the bit will get very hot. So you don't want to be touching the bit with your hands. Another thing about these drills, they're big drills, and if the bit happens to jam in the bottom of the hole for some reason, the drill will go round and round, and your arms will go round and round, and maybe you will go round and round. So I usually have the base body of the drill braced against my leg just in case that bit jams. You'll notice as I start drilling, just to get the hole started in the right place, you can angle the drill till you get a dimple going, and that helps as you get the hole started. Okay, we'll drill these last couple holes. A final thing to mention with drilling is that the angle that you hold the drill at needs to be consistent for all the holes. So if you're looking down from the end, if this hole's going in that way, I need to make sure that all the holes are just the same. And then I'm not drilling one hole like that and the next hole like that, because if I do that, if the rock does split, it's going to be very uneven and it probably won't even split properly. So you want to make sure all those holes are lined up. The next step in the process is that we need to have the holes clean and cleared out with dust. Some people just over drill the depth of their hole and let some dust stay in the bottom. That can work okay. The disadvantage is more time drilling, more wear and tear on the drill bits, and also you can end up losing your little feathers and wedges down the hole and they can be very hard to get out. I use just a short piece of hose to blow the dust out by hand. I found that vacuums, like little vacuums, tend to clog instantly with the dust because it's so fine. And an air compressor just blows the dust everywhere, and we don't really want that for health reasons. All right, here we go. So the easiest way to get these into the holes without losing pieces down the hole is to hold them in a set like this, where the two feathers are all the way down and the wedge is just started in the feathers, just like that, and then insert that into the hole. And you want the feathers to go just about all the way down so that the wings are right down at or near the top surface of the rock. And these sets have been used for a couple of years and they're getting a bit beat up, but they still work just fine. Now, notice the direction of these wings on the feathers. They're perpendicular to the crack that we're gonna achieve, the split that we're gonna achieve. And that's super important because if you were to put it in this way, it would try to crack the rock that way. So we want them just like that. And it's really important if they're off subtly, you'll get a wobbly crack. So you really want to pay attention to having them nice and perpendicular to the split that you're trying to achieve. It's very, very common when people over drill the depth of the holes. Well, a couple of things can happen. One is that the feathers will get sucked down into the hole rather than staying put and expanding. You can see that the feather's fatter at the bottom, so part of the splitting action is coming from the feather. And if the hole is deep, these can just get sucked down into the hole. And as I mentioned before, you can accidentally drop them down the hole, and they can be quite difficult to get out. A little magnet is really helpful for that. Find a couple here that aren't too beat up. Okay. There we are. We've got all 7 of those started. We'll get these out of the way. Once all of your feathers and wedges are nicely placed, we're going to start with just a couple of taps to firmly get these set into the holes. And you can notice the sound changes with those. The higher pitched the sound, the tighter the feather and wedge is. The duller, the less tight it is. And so we want to try to concentrate on the duller ones right now at the beginning a little bit to get them all set pretty tightly with just a couple of taps. And you notice I'm just doing a single tap on each one. And it's important to give the rock time to get used to that pressure and not to drive them through fast. So I usually wait 30 seconds to a minute between strikes, but I'm not going to be doing nothing during that time. Usually I'll have 10 or more of these rocks set up to split. So I'll drill one, go set the wedges in the next one, hammer on the previous one, and I keep cycling through. So I'm working all the time. A safety note, every once in a while you'll find a type of rock that has a little bit of springiness to it, and it occasionally can shoot the feathers back out when you hammer on them. So I always say, don't stand over them as you're hammering on them, just in case. It's very unusual, but it can happen. All right, we'll give these another set of taps. So I'm using a 3-pound hammer for this. Some people like a 1-pound hammer. You don't want to be wailing on them, at least definitely not with these 1/2-inch ones in the beginning. But a firm tap to set them in. You know, if you're just doing that, it's not going to do anything. The other important thing is I'm keeping an equal pressure. So I'm starting at this end, going down, start back at this end. If I went this way, hammered back that way, this one has twice as much pressure. So we'll do this again. Here's some pitch changes there. Sometimes you'll get little spalls off the edge. Just gonna wait a minute. As you're doing a big block, you can actually use these down 3 sides or even all 4 sides on a big block. The more you use, the more precise your crack is going to be. Oftentimes in dry stone walling, we're not too concerned about the preciseness. We're just trying to get something of appropriate size and shape. If you're looking for a really straight crack, you can do an additional step, often before you drill the holes, where you'd score a line. In this case with the stone busters, you could also use a tracing chisel, but you'd go along and score a whole line. Again, it could be on one side, it could be on 2, 3, or 4 sides of the rock, depending on how precise you want, to get a groove going for where you're trying to get that rock to break. In this case, I'm not too worried about it. It's a pretty small rock to break, and I'm not too worried about having a precise break. And we haven't started to see a crack yet. We've got a couple little flakes coming off at the top. When you're splitting a harder stone like this granite, the small feather and wedges work great. The way that they work is you're putting compression right on either side of the feather, but the result of that is the whole stone is actually in tension between those. and stone in tension is very weak, and that's how this works. If you're in a softer stone, like a softer sandstone, say, that's a good reason to actually go up a size, because rather than splitting in tension between the feathers and wedges, the stone will just crush around the feather. So if you're with a type of stone that crushes pretty readily, going to a bigger size can help. All right, I just heard it start to crack. And you can see now we have a crack line forming. And I'm gonna give it just a little bit of a pause. Hopefully that crack's gonna go nicely down the rock. You can hear the pitch changing as you're hitting. It's getting much duller. There we are. And you can see how smooth and flat that split was with just these little holes. There's no reason to be drilling deep into the rock. This is the hard part now. Gather up all your feathers and wedges. I like to lay them out to make sure that I have the right number of sets of them, because they're very easy to lose. So there we are, all 7 sets on that rock. We have a nicely split stone here. So something I haven't talked about is why we would use feather and wedges as opposed to just using hammers or chisels. And the feather and wedges work really well to give you a pretty precise break, and it's much less work on our bodies to do. You could theoretically trace a line and snap this rock with the stone busters eventually, but it would take probably a couple hundred hits, if not a couple thousand. And because we're splitting this on the long axis of the stone, there's a very good likelihood it would snap in half on the short axis at some point as we were hammering on it, because it's weaker in that direction. So we're able to achieve this split much quicker with much less wear and tear on our bodies, and with a greater chance of success using the feather and wedges. And primarily we use them on bigger pieces of stone. It is slower than a small stone where you could efficiently do it with the hammers. Try to encourage it to crack straight down. Sometimes that helps give it a little bit more encouragement to split where we want. Just starting to crack now. Let's see how it does. You can hear the sound changing. Now, sometimes at this point, these are loose, and you can just pull them out. They've done the job, and they don't get lost that way. Where's my container? More tap on that. There we go. And on this end, you can see where I hammered that, it's split exactly on it. So a little history here. This method of splitting, the earliest known documentation of it is from 1823. It became very popular around 1830, 1835, and really took over the stone splitting methods in the quarries from earlier methods. Back then, of course, they were drilling the holes by hand with a grinding chisel, or sometimes called a star chisel. So it'd take a lot longer to drill the holes, and that's part of why historically they would minimize the depth and length, depth and distance between the holes to the absolute minimum that they needed. Very often, historically, a block like this, you might see 3 holes drilled about that deep. And that would split a block like this if you were in a good vein of stone and they knew that it would work well. Nowadays, with the power drills, it's so easy to drill the holes that we do a little bit more because we have a better chance of it working. The half circle marks from the drill holes can be used to help date an old wall or old buildings. If you see those, you can pretty well guarantee that's probably after 1823 that work had been done. And if you see a slight spiral striation in the holes, that tells you that it was done with a pneumatic or a power drill as opposed to done by hand. If the hole actually increases in diameter as it goes in, it was almost always drilled by hand. So that can further help you to date the time period when the stonework was done. So this granite came from Rock of Ages up in Barrie, Vermont. And these are pieces of what's known as waste blocks, which at the quarry, for whatever reason, was determined didn't meet the spec that they were looking for. Maybe there was some color defect or an internal crack that they saw or some other defect, or wasn't the dimension they needed. And they're set aside and they're sold relatively inexpensively. They come as big blocks. These pieces had already been broken down. The biggest challenge is you need a big piece of equipment to unload the truck when it comes. And so I'm just taking a moment to just also trace a line here to show you what that looks like. There's different types of drills. All of them, it's very important that you do not push down hard as you're drilling. You're holding it enough to keep it steady, to keep it from wobbling, but you're not bearing down on it. If you bear down on it with a lot of weight, the friction on the bit will heat up and you'll lose your bit very quickly, sometimes in the first hole. So I'm just, it looks like I'm pushing down, I'm not. I'm basically just holding it there. And it's really important as you're drilling. So a question comes up sometimes, what if you do this and you pound the wedges all the way down and the rock doesn't split? If that happens, usually the easiest recourse is to drill between and go to the next bigger size so that you get that much more pressure. So I might go up to the 3/4 inch size, and hopefully at that point, usually you're just trying to split the rock enough that you can recover your feather and wedges as opposed to get it to do what you want, because it's telling you it's probably not splitting well. And that happens a fair bit with field stone where you don't really know what the grain is. Here we are. You can see the crack forming. You can just start to hear the crack forming. It's important when you do this too that you make sure that when that rock splits open, you don't have a foot or a leg or a tool in the way. You can hear the pitch is totally changed. There we go. And you can see by tracing that line, we got a much straighter cut across the top. It also pretty much exactly followed where I traced, except for right down at the very corner there. So a nice straight break. This followed somewhat, again, right at the bottom corner, veered off just a little bit, but a nice straight break overall.